The annals of imperial China are written in the ink of sanctioned history, a grand narrative detailing the lives of emperors and the thousands of women in the harem whose purpose was singular: to produce an heir for the dragon throne. This is the story we know, a familiar tale of silk pavilions and dynastic succession. But within the gilded cage of the Forbidden City, another history was lived entirely in the shadows, a parallel court of affection and ambition that defied every tenet of the established order. It was a world not of empresses and concubines, but of favored boys whose power was absolute, yet terrifyingly ephemeral. A life of unimaginable luxury balanced on the knife's edge of an emperor's whim. This is their secret. The great engine of the Chinese Empire was fueled not by steel or fire, but by blood. And within the high vermilion walls of the Forbidden City, the methodical production of this bloodline was a matter of grim, industrial science. The imperial harem was not a sanctuary of romance or a garden of earthly delights. It was a complex and chillingly efficient piece of state machinery, a human factory whose sole product was stability in the form of a male heir. Thousands of women were gathered from across the realm, their individual histories and hopes rendered irrelevant the moment they passed through the palace gates, each becoming a component in the vast, unfeeling calculus of dynastic survival. They were meticulously categorized and ranked within a hierarchy as rigid and unforgiving as any military command structure. With the empress enthroned at the apex of a pyramid of noble consorts, ladies of the first rank, and countless other gradations of imperial women, each with her own prescribed duties, privileges, and proximity to the emperor's bedchamber. This entire system was the ultimate expression of Confucian order, the philosophical bedrock of the empire, which dictated that the continuation of the patrilineal line was a sacred duty, an obligation not just to the living, but to the infinite chain of ancestors whose spirits demanded a successor. A woman's body was therefore not her own. It was a vessel for the future of the dynasty. Her womb, a battleground of political ambition. Her value was measured in a single, brutal metric: her capacity to produce a son. A beautiful face or a sharp mind might grant her fleeting favor, but only the birth of a boy could give her true status, transforming her from a decorative object into a genuine political entity, a matriarch of a potential future emperor. The air within these perfumed prisons was thick with a silent, desperate warfare, a daily struggle for the emperor's attention, not for love, but for the chance at conception, the one act that could elevate a woman from obscurity to immortality. Every smile was a strategy, every whispered word a potential gambit in the relentless pursuit of genetic viability. This was not a life of passion but of managed reproduction on a scale almost too vast to comprehend. A world where the individual was utterly subsumed by the implacable, blood-hungry demands of the throne. It was a system designed to eliminate chance, but in doing so, it also sought to eliminate the human heart. Into this world of rigid genealogical obsession, a world governed by the cold mechanics of succession, there emerged a specter that threatened to shatter the entire machine. For alongside the sanctioned court of empresses and consorts, there existed another, unofficial court, a phantom government of one that operated entirely in the shadows of the emperor's heart. Here, the central figure was not a concubine, a title with at least a defined, if subservient role, but something far more dangerous: a male favorite. This individual was a living paradox, a walking, breathing violation of the natural order as decreed by the ancestors. He held no official rank that could explain his influence, no place in the intricate bureaucratic diagrams that mapped out the empire's power. He was a dangerous anomaly, a political black hole whose immense gravitational pull was generated not by law, lineage, or military might, but by a force the Confucian system could neither regulate nor comprehend: the emperor's personal, and often absolute, affection. His power, therefore, was both total and breathtakingly fragile. On any given day, a word from him could see a general demoted or a minister elevated. His whisper could redirect the flow of treasury funds or redraw the map of a province. He was the secret key to the Son of Heaven, and the court, with its ancient hierarchies and gray-bearded officials, was forced to orbit this strange, unsanctioned sun. Yet, this entire reality was built not on the stone foundations of the state, but on the capricious, fluttering heartbeat of a single man. An emperor's favor could cool like a dying ember, and with it, the favorite's universe would simply cease to exist. Unlike an empress, who had the protection of her clan and the potential power of a son, the male favorite had nothing to fall back on. His existence was a high-wire act performed without a net, over a pit of vipers. Every day he held on to his precarious position was a testament to his charm, intelligence, and emotional mastery. But every night he faced the terrifying knowledge that his authority was a phantom, a shimmering mirage that could vanish with the morning sun, leaving him utterly alone and defenseless against the system he had so profoundly disrupted. This dangerous dance between the throne and its unsanctioned intimate was not a new invention, not a sudden corruption of one dynasty, but an ancient ghost that haunted the imperial corridors, a recurring tragedy played out across the centuries, with only the names of the players changing. Long before the great Han emperors, back in the mists of the Zhou dynasty, these cautionary tales were already being etched into the nation's memory, serving as grim warnings for any who dared to build a life on the ephemeral foundation of a ruler's love. We must travel back to the state of Wei, to the court of Duke Ling, to find one of the most chilling and instructive of these precedents, the story of the beautiful Misi Shia. For a time, Misi Shia was the center of the Duke's universe, and the Duke's affection was a sun that warmed and illuminated his every action, transforming potential transgressions into virtues. When Misi Shia heard his mother was dying, he did not hesitate. He forged an order to use the Duke's personal chariot, a crime punishable by a terrible amputation, to race to her side. When the Duke learned of this, he did not rage, but wept with admiration, declaring to the court how profound his favorite's filial piety must be to make him forget even the threat of mutilation. Later, while strolling through an orchard, Misi Shia bit into a peach of such incredible sweetness that he stopped mid-bite and, in a gesture of pure, unthinking intimacy, offered the remainder to his lord so that he too could share the pleasure. Again, the Duke was overjoyed, praising Misi Shia for his selflessness, for thinking of his sovereign even before himself. These were the golden days, when the grammar of their relationship was written in the language of devotion. But love, especially the love of a powerful man, is a notoriously fickle season. Years passed, Misi Shia's youthful beauty began to fade, and the Duke's affections inevitably cooled, curdling into indifference and finally into contempt. The sun that had once illuminated now cast long, cold shadows, and the Duke began to resent the very intimacy he had once craved. Seeking to rid himself of his former favorite, he summoned the court and, in a voice dripping with venom, reinterpreted the past, turning cherished memories into a list of crimes. He accused Misi Shia of arrogance and disrespect, thundering that this man had once brazenly stolen his chariot and, in an act of ultimate insolence, had dared to feed him a disgusting half-eaten peach. The exact same acts, once lauded as proofs of love, were now the evidence for his condemnation. Misi Shia's fate was sealed not by any new crime, but by the simple, brutal fact that the Duke no longer loved him. His story became an eternal parable on the terrifying nature of autocratic power, a lesson written in the bitter juice of a discarded peach, that in the unofficial court of favor, there are no laws, only the whims of a heart, and when that heart turns to stone, the past itself becomes a weapon. From these ancient cautionary ghosts, our story now solidifies into flesh and blood, coalescing in the grand, suffocating halls of the Han Dynasty, a period of immense power and equally immense internal decay. The narrative now narrows its focus to a single point in time, the year 7 before Christ, and to a single man who held the fate of the world in his hands, Emperor Ai, the new son of heaven. He was a young ruler, barely 20 years old, yet he already carried the crushing weight of his office with a profound and visible melancholy, a quiet sorrow in his eyes that spoke of a man alienated from his own life, a sovereign trapped within the gilded cage of ritual and expectation. He sat upon the dragon throne. But his spirit seemed to wander through the endless, dreary landscape of state ceremonies, bored by the droning of his ministers and the rigid formality that governed his every breath. It was into this gray, predictable world that a single, vivid spark of color would fall. An intrusion of beauty so profound it would set the very foundations of the empire trembling. He was a minor official named Dong Xian, a man of such inconsequential rank he was little more than part of the palace scenery, perhaps a herald announcing the hours, his voice one of many that marked the tedious passage of imperial time. But one day, as he stood at his post, the emperor's weary gaze drifted across the assembled courtiers and, for the first time, truly saw him. What he saw was not the bearing of a soldier or the cunning of a politician, but a vision of languid, almost liquid grace, a gentle femininity in his features and a serene calmness in his posture that stood in shocking contrast to the stiff, masculine ambition surrounding him. In that instant, the world of Emperor I fractured. The droning of the court faded to a distant hum. The faces of his most powerful ministers blurred into an indistinguishable tapestry of age and disapproval, and his entire universe contracted to encompass the serene, unsuspecting form of Dong Xian. It was not a political calculation or a strategic assessment. It was an ambush of the soul, a sudden and total infatuation that was as violent and inescapable as a lightning strike. The encounter was a moment of profound and terrible destiny. A single glance that served as the catalyst for an obsession that would soon consume an emperor, defy 1,000 years of tradition, and set a course for a collision between personal desire and imperial duty, from which no one would emerge unscathed. The machine of state had just met its ghost. That single, fateful glance was the spark that ignited a political firestorm, a blaze of imperial favor that would consume the established order of the Han court with breathtaking speed. The transformation of Dong Xian's life was not a gradual ascent but a violent, vertical launch into the very stratosphere of power. From a man whose existence was barely noted, he became the emperor's shadow, his constant companion in the throne room, in the private gardens, and most scandalously, in the imperial bedchamber. The machinery of state, which for centuries had moved with a slow, deliberate, and predictable rhythm, was violently repurposed to serve the emperor's obsession. An avalanche of honors, titles, and lands was unleashed upon Dong Xian, a deluge of wealth so vast it eclipsed the holdings of families who had served the dynasty for generations. Decrees were issued in a blur, each one elevating him higher, cementing a power that had no precedent and no justification beyond the emperor's desire. He was made a marquis, then given control of key court functions, his soft, youthful hands now guiding levers of power once held by the most seasoned ministers. But the true shattering of tradition, the act that sent a tremor of pure horror through the court's old guard, was his appointment as the supreme commander of the armed forces. Imagine the scene: the grizzled, battle-scarred generals, men who had spent their lives on the empire's violent frontiers, their faces maps of old wounds and hard-won victories, now forced to kneel and take orders from a beautiful, languid courtier who had never held a sword in anger. Their silent, seething contempt was a palpable force in the room, a poison that began to seep into the very foundations of the palace. And the emperor's favor did not stop with Dong Xian. It was a golden tide that lifted his entire family into a new, unbelievable reality. His father was granted a noble title. His relatives were showered with influential positions, and his wife and sister were brought to live within the palace, treated with the reverence normally reserved for imperial princesses. They were draped in silks so fine and jewels so rare that their very presence was a dazzling, garish insult to the court's austere, Confucian sensibilities. This sudden, unearned opulence was a constant, visible reminder that the rules no longer applied, that merit and service meant nothing. The empire was no longer a meritocracy of loyal ministers. It was the private dominion of one man's heart, and at its center sat Dong Xian, a beautiful, smiling catastrophe. Amidst this relentless accumulation of titles and the rising tide of silent resentment, there came a moment not of public spectacle, but of profound and world-altering quiet. A single, intimate gesture that would be remembered long after the gold had tarnished and the titles had been stripped away. It is to this quiet moment that the entire legend of their love is anchored. Imagine the scene. A drowsy afternoon in the emperor's private chambers, the clamor of the court, a distant, muffled sea. The only sound, the gentle hum of a cicada outside the painted screens. Sunlight, thick with dust motes, slants across the lacquered floor where Emperor Ai and Dong Xian are napping together on a wide sleeping mat. A shared, unguarded moment of peace in the heart of a political storm. The emperor, ruler of the known world, awakes first. His mind slowly returning from the fog of sleep to the pressing weight of his duties. A specific hour has been set for an audience with his ministers. A time when he must once again become the unfeeling, impersonal Son of Heaven. He prepares to rise, but feels a gentle, warm weight upon his arm. He looks down to see Dong Xian, lost in a deep and peaceful slumber, his head resting trustingly upon the long, magnificent silk sleeve of the emperor's formal robe, a garment woven with the golden threads of dragons, the very symbol of his divine authority. Here, then, was the central conflict of the emperor's life, distilled into a single, silent dilemma. On one side lay the empire, with its rigid schedules, its ancestral obligations, and its unceasing demands. On the other lay the sleeping form of the man he loved, a picture of serene vulnerability he could not bear to shatter. To wake him would be to choose duty. To remain would be to fail it. For a long moment, the emperor did not move, a statue carved from conflict. Then, with a slowness and deliberation that was almost prayer-like, he made his choice. He reached for the small, ornate dagger that hung from his belt, its hilt carved from jade, its purpose purely ceremonial. The faint rasp of the blade leaving its sheath was the only sound as he brought the cold, sharp steel not to an enemy, but to his own imperial vestment. With painstaking precision, he sliced through the precious dragon-embroidered silk, carefully, silently, severing the sleeve from the body of the robe. He then slid away, leaving the detached piece of fabric behind as a soft pillow for his lover's head. A silent testament to his decision. In this one extraordinary act, Emperor A had chosen love over duty, the personal over the political, sacrificing a piece of his own imperial identity to preserve a moment of peace. It was an act of quiet rebellion that would give their story its immortal name. The passion of the cut sleeve. The quiet, intimate rebellion of the cut sleeve was a private matter, a secret whispered between two lovers. But the emperor's obsession could not be contained within the palace bedchambers forever. It was a force of nature, a flood of feeling that would inevitably breach the walls of decorum and crash into the public court with the force of a tidal wave. The moment of impact, the true political zenith of this dangerous affair, arrived during a grand imperial banquet. Imagine the scene. The great hall is ablaze with 1,000 lanterns, the air thick with the scent of wine and roasted meats, and the assembled nobility and ministers of the Han Empire are arranged in their strict, unyielding order of precedence. Dong Xian, radiant in his fine silks, sits in a position of honor so close to the emperor that it constitutes a physical affront to every official in the room. Throughout the evening, Emperor Ai barely touches his food, his gaze fixed upon his favorite, his eyes filled with an adoration so total it seems to have blinded him to the world of politics and consequence. Then, in a pause between musical performances, the emperor rises, his cup of wine held aloft. A hush falls over the hall. What comes next is not a toast or a routine pronouncement, but a statement so shocking, so fundamentally heretical, that it stops the heart of the empire. Looking directly at Dong Xian, the emperor declares that he wishes to emulate the ancient sage king Yao, the mythical paragon of virtue, who, seeing a worthy successor, passed the entire world to him, bypassing his own unworthy son. The implication is immediate, terrifying, and unambiguous. He wants to abdicate and hand the dragon throne to Dong Xian. For a single, eternal moment, the hall is plunged into a silence so profound it is like the bottom of the ocean. The music dies, conversations choke in the throat, and the only sound is the sputtering of 100 candles. The faces of the ministers, moments before engaged in feigned pleasantries, are now frozen masks of ashen horror. This was not merely an insult to their dignity. It was blasphemy. A proposal to sever the sacred bloodline of the Liu clan, to tear up the mandate of heaven itself and discard it like a cheap scroll. The empire, they believed, was not the emperor's personal property to be given away as a lover's gift. Finally, one senior minister, his face pale but his voice shaking with righteous fury, broke the spell. He fell to his knees, not in supplication, but in protest, reminding the emperor that the throne was a trust from the ancestors, an inheritance to be passed to his own blood, not a trinket for a favorite. Though the emperor, angered by the rebuke, dismissed the minister, the damage was irrevocably done. In that moment, Dong Xian's fate was sealed. He was no longer a scandalous indulgence or a political rival. He was now a direct, existential threat to the dynasty itself. A potential usurper. The latent disapproval of the court had instantly crystallized into a cold, hard, and murderous opposition. They were no longer just watching him with contempt. They were now waiting for the emperor to die. The intricate web of power, passion, and political heresy that Emperor Ai had woven was predicated on a single, fragile assumption: that he would live to protect it. But the mandate of heaven is not a permanent contract, and the body of an emperor is still just a body of flesh and blood, susceptible to the same mundane frailties as the lowest peasant. The end did not come with the drama of an assassin's blade or a climactic battle, but with the pathetic indignity of a sudden, wasting sickness, a fever that burned through the palace for a few agonizing days, defying the desperate remedies of the imperial physicians. On a sweltering morning in the first year, before Christ, the great dragon of the Han Dynasty simply stopped breathing. The moment of death was a quiet, almost imperceptible event, a final, shallow exhalation of air into the heavy, incense-choked atmosphere of the imperial bedchamber. For an instant, nothing changed. Dong Xian, who had not left the emperor's side, still held the monarch's hand, perhaps not even registering the precise second that the life had fled from it. But then came the chilling, undeniable signs of physical finality. The faint warmth that had lingered in the emperor's skin began its inexorable retreat, replaced by a cold, waxy pallor. The slackness of the jaw, the vacant stare of the half-open eyes, these were the grotesque biological truths that no amount of imperial power could deny. The source of Dong Xian's entire world, the sun around which his universe had been configured, was now just a cooling piece of meat on a silk sheet. And as this realization dawned in his mind, a new phenomenon began. A terrifying silence. The news did not need to be shouted from the rooftops. It spread like a frost, creeping out from the death chamber, down the long corridors, and across the vast courtyards. The ever-present hum of the palace, the music, the chatter, the rhythmic tread of the guards, all of it just stopped. It was a silence that was not empty, but filled with a dreadful predatory anticipation. In that silence, Dong Xian's power, his titles, his wealth, and his future were utterly annihilated. It was not a gradual decline, it was an instantaneous extinguishment. Like a lantern flame snuffed out in a gale. One moment he was the most powerful man in the empire. The next, he was nothing more than a terrified young man trapped in a room with a corpse, the very air crackling with the triumphant hatred of the enemies who now surrounded him. His isolation was absolute. The man he loved was gone, and with him, the entire world he had been given. The terrified silence that had descended upon the palace was not a void, but a vacuum. And as the laws of nature and politics both dictate, it had to be filled. While Dong Xian remained frozen in the grip of his personal apocalypse, paralyzed by the cold reality of his lover's corpse, the abstract forces of tradition and vengeance he had so long ignored were coalescing into a single, tangible, and terrifying form. The system's antibody, the walking, breathing embodiment of the old order, was the Grand Empress Dowager Wang. She was a woman forged in the crucible of court intrigue, a patient, iron-willed matriarch who had watched her grandson's scandalous obsession with a cold, calculating fury, viewing it not as a matter of the heart but as a cancerous growth on the body of the dynasty she represented. For her, the emperor's final breath was not a cause for grief but a signal, the starting gun for a counter-revolution she had been planning in the shadows of her own quiet chambers. As the life fled from Emperor I, she did not weep. She moved. Her first and only objective was a small, deceptively simple object of almost mystical importance: the imperial seal. It was a piece of pure white jade, the legendary hashibi, carved for the first emperor of China. And it was the ultimate symbol of the mandate of heaven. To possess the seal was to possess legitimacy. To hold it was to speak with the voice of the dynasty itself. Dong Xian, in his capacity as the emperor's most intimate attendant, was the de facto guardian of this sacred object. But in his grief-shattered state, he had likely forgotten it even existed. The dowager did not forget. With a speed that belied her age, she swept through the palace, her retinue of eunuchs and guards a silent, disciplined force. She did not rush to the side of her dead grandson to perform the rites of mourning. She went directly for the source of all power. The confrontation was as swift as it was brutal. She entered the death chamber, a cold wind of purpose in the stagnant air of sorrow, her eyes ignoring the body on the bed and fixing on the small, silk-wrapped box containing the seal. Dong Xian, looking up with the dazed, uncomprehending eyes of a man who has lost everything, was no match for the sheer, unadulterated force of her will. There were no words exchanged, no arguments made. She simply took it. Her guards secured the chamber, and with that one decisive act of appropriation, the war for the empire was over, before it had even begun. With the jade seal in her cold hands, she was now the regent, the state, the legitimate authority. The ministers and generals who had been paralyzed by the emperor's death now had a new sun to orbit. Before Dong Xian had even begun to navigate the depths of his own personal sorrow, the political world had been remade, and its first central law was his utter and complete destruction. The seizure of the seal was the gunshot. What followed was the slow, agonizing bleed out of Dong Xian's entire world. His fall was not a swift, clean execution, but a meticulously orchestrated psychological dismantling, a slow, suffocating death by 1,000 cuts administered by the cold, silent vengeance of the court. He was immediately confined to his own palace, a place that overnight had transformed from a symbol of his unprecedented power into a gilded tomb. The very silks he had once flaunted now seemed to mock him from their chests, and the priceless artifacts gifted by his imperial lover felt like tombstones in the suffocating silence. The first edict arrived, read by a eunuch whose voice was devoid of all emotion, a flat recitation of supposed crimes against the state that officially stripped him of every title, every rank, and every acre of land. In the space of a single pronouncement, the Grand Marshal, the beloved of the Son of Heaven, was reduced to a commoner, a non-entity awaiting disposal. Then came the relentless, silent pressure. The servants vanished, melting back into the city. The guards outside his gates, once a symbol of his protection, now stood with their backs to him, their purpose no longer to keep assassins out, but to keep him in. He was left utterly alone with his wife and the ghost of the man he had loved, trapped in a shrinking world where every shadow seemed to hold a new terror and every creak of the floorboards heralded the arrival of the executioner. The grief for Emperor A was a raw, open wound, but now it was salted with the acid of pure, animal fear. Days bled into sleepless nights, his mind a feverish torment of loving memories and horrific premonitions. Finally, when his spirit had been sufficiently marinated in dread, the final messenger arrived. The scroll was unfurled, its silk whispering a death sentence. It did not condemn him to the executioner's block. The dowager's revenge was more subtle, more cruel. The edict, in its cold, formal language, granted him the imperial favor of taking his own life, a final, grotesque parody of the affection he had once known. That night, in the heart of their silent, empty palace, Dong Xian and his wife performed the last ritual of their brief, brilliant reign. They bathed and dressed in simple white robes, the color of mourning. There was no ceremony, no weeping, only the grim, shared understanding of two people cornered by an unfeeling state. What followed was a final, horrific intimacy. A shared act of self-annihilation to escape the coming humiliation. A grim conclusion that left two young bodies hanging still and silent in the opulent darkness. A testament to a love that had soared to the sun only to be utterly and irrevocably destroyed. The physical extinction of Dong Xian and his wife was merely the first step in the court's meticulous and chillingly thorough campaign of erasure. A body, after all, is easy to dispose of, but a memory, a legacy, is a far more resilient entity. The new regime, under the cold guidance of the Grand Empress Dowager, understood that true power lay not only in controlling the present, but in rewriting the past. The first act of this historical revisionism was a brutal physical desecration. Dong Xian had been granted the supreme honor of having his tomb constructed on the grounds of the imperial mausoleum, a final resting place beside his beloved emperor, intended to sanctify their bond for eternity. This could not be allowed to stand. An edict was issued, and a team of laborers, like grim morticians, descended upon the opulent tomb. They smashed the ornate gates, chiseled away the loving inscriptions, and stripped the burial chamber of the priceless treasures that had been interred with the bodies. The coffins of Dong Xian and his wife were exhumed from their hallowed ground, and in an act of ultimate posthumous humiliation were carted away to be reburied in a simple, unmarked plot. A final, spiteful severing of their connection to the imperial line. The erasure then spread to the living, as his entire clan was systematically dismantled, their titles revoked and wealth confiscated, wiping the Dong family from the ledgers of power. But the most effective and enduring act of vengeance took place not with shovels and hammers, but with ink and brushes. In the silent, dusty archives of the official court historians, here the real murder was committed. The murder of a character. The scribes, now instruments of the Dowager's will, began to carefully craft the official narrative, a politically necessary fiction designed to cauterize the scandalous wound on the dynasty's reputation. Dong Xien, the object of an emperor's profound love, was meticulously remolded into a villain of almost cartoonish depravity. His beauty was recorded as a sinister, effeminate weapon of seduction. His gentle nature was reinterpreted as cunning manipulation. He became a greedy, power-hungry parasite who had sunk his claws into a weak and impressionable ruler. Correspondingly, Emperor Ai was posthumously absolved of his agency. He was no longer a man who had made a defiant choice, but a tragic, flawed sovereign who had been bewitched. His judgment clouded by an unnatural passion. This narrative was perfect. It preserved the sanctity of the imperial institution by sacrificing the reputations of two dead men. And this version, this carefully constructed lie, is largely what survived. The real story of their love was buried far deeper than Dong Xian's desecrated corpse, proving that the final act of power is always to control the story. The brutal and comprehensive erasure of Dong Xian's legacy served its purpose as a terrifying cautionary tale, ensuring that no future favorite would ever again dare to reach for the throne itself. The political ambition of the emperor's male lover was effectively cauterized, but the desire that underpinned the entire tradition was not so easily extinguished. The passion did not die. It simply flowed out of the dangerously exposed landscape of the imperial court and into the more discreet, shadowy estuaries of private society. The phenomenon was decentralized, moving from the singular, all-powerful emperor to the broader, influential class of scholar officials, wealthy merchants, and celebrated artists who shaped the culture of the later Ming and Qing dynasties. In this new world, the object of affection was no longer a courtier or a general, but a figure of exquisite, manufactured beauty, the young male actor of the Chinese opera. This was a world where artifice and reality beautifully and dangerously blurred. These actors, particularly those who specialized in the Dan roles, The female characters were trained from boyhood in a rigorous curriculum of song, dance, poetry, and impossibly graceful movement. They were living works of art, their faces painted into masks of idealized femininity, their bodies draped in shimmering silks, their voices trained to produce ethereal, lilting melodies. On stage, they were the very embodiment of a romantic, unattainable female beauty. And offstage, this alluring androgynous charm captivated the very men who were the gatekeepers of high culture. A powerful official or a rich salt merchant would become the patron of a particularly gifted young actor, providing for his every need, nurturing his career, and, in the privacy of his elegant mansion, making the actor his companion and lover. These were complex relationships, a murky blend of genuine affection, aesthetic appreciation, financial dependency, and an undeniable power imbalance. The love of a patron could elevate an actor to a life of unimaginable luxury and artistic fulfillment. But unlike Dong Xian, this favoritism conferred no official political power. It was a passion confined to the realm of culture, a secret celebrated in private poetry circles and whispered about at lavish banquets. This demotion from a potential threat to the state to a sophisticated cultural pursuit was the tradition's key to survival. The ghost of Emperor Ai and Dong Xian still haunted the elite, but its terrifying power had been tamed. Its story transformed from a political tragedy into an aesthetic, and far safer, romance. We now arrive at the heart of our story. The central question that has lingered like a ghost behind every tale of passion and political ruin. What was the true nature of this secret life? The word itself is a deception, for the secret was rarely a matter of concealment. The relationship between Emperor Ai and Dong Xian was not hidden. It was scandalously, flagrantly public, a spectacle of favor played out on the grand stage of the imperial court. The secret, therefore, was not that nobody knew. It was that the relationship, in the eyes of the state and its rigid ideology, did not and could not officially exist. It was a phantom limb of the body politic, a thing whose presence was undeniably felt, but which had no place on any anatomical chart. The entire moral and legal framework of Chinese society, dictated by a strict Confucian worldview, was built upon the bedrock of the family unit, an institution with a clear and singular purpose, the continuation of the ancestral line. Every person had a defined role in this great procreative enterprise. A male favorite, however, was a profound and terrifying anomaly. He fit nowhere. He produced no heirs, held no sanctioned title for his intimacy, and served no purpose in the great chain of being. He was a social null value, a human category error, and his very existence in a position of influence was a silent, corrosive challenge to the entire system. This is the perilous gray area in which he lived and died. Because his position was unsanctioned, it was inherently illegitimate, and this illegitimacy was his fatal weakness. His power, though immense, was built on the sand of the emperor's personal affection, not the rock of law or tradition. He was the emperor's exposed flank, a walking, breathing political liability. For any rival faction in the court, the favorite was the perfect target, a way to attack the emperor's judgment and authority without committing treason. By wrapping their political ambition in the righteous cloak of Confucian morality, they could frame their opposition not as a power grab, but as a noble crusade to save the throne from an unnatural, corrupting influence. The favorite was not just a man, he was a symptom of disorder, and the court physicians were sharpening their knives, ready to carve him out. Their life was a secret then, because it was lived on a knife's edge, in plain sight but without a scrap of legal or moral armor, a life of immense power that was, at its core, utterly and indefensibly vulnerable. And yet, after all the political maneuvering, the brutal purges, and the meticulous rewriting of the official record, a strange and beautiful irony began to bloom from the blood-soaked earth of Dong Xian's grave. The victors, in their cold, calculating efficiency, had succeeded in everything they set out to do. They had destroyed the man, dismantled his family, and poisoned his name in the state-sanctioned annals of history. By every conventional measure of power, their victory was total. But they made a fatal miscalculation. A failure to understand that a political narrative can be controlled, but a truly powerful human story has a life of its own. They could not kill the gesture. While the official histories recorded the long list of titles and the fabricated crimes, it was that one quiet, intimate moment in the emperor's chamber that refused to be buried. The image of a ruler sacrificing a piece of his own imperial identity, the very symbol of his power, for the simple, tender purpose of not disturbing his sleeping lover, was an anecdote of such profound romantic power that it broke free from its historical container. The phrase born from that act, Dong Xian, the passion of the cut sleeve, began a new life, completely separate from the political scandal that had birthed it. It became a cultural artifact, a poetic and elegant euphemism for love between men, whispered in the gardens of scholars and written into the verses of poets for the next 2,000 years. It was a code, a way of speaking about a forbidden and unsanctioned love in a language of tragic beauty. The story survived, not as a dry entry in the official record, but as a living piece of culture, its meaning preserved in the warm, beating heart of literature and art. The Grand Empress Dowager Wang and the ministers who orchestrated Dong Xian's destruction are now little more than footnotes. Their names remembered only by specialist historians. They won the war for the throne, but they lost the war for the narrative. The romance of the story, the very thing they sought to frame as a corrupting disease, proved to be its armor, protecting it from the dust and decay of official condemnation. In the end, the most enduring legacy of this entire affair was not the restoration of the Liu clan's honor or a shift in court politics, but a simple, four-character phrase that ensured the love they tried so desperately to erase would, in its own way, achieve a kind of immortality. So we are left, at the end of this long and bloody history, not with a simple verdict, but with a profound and unsettling question about the very nature of power itself. What happens when the messy, unpredictable, and deeply human affair of the heart collides with the cold, impersonal, and rigid machinery of the state? Was Dong Xian truly a manipulative villain, a cancerous presence on the body politic, or was his only real crime the simple, fatal act of loving a man who happened to be an emperor? And was Emperor I a weak-willed ruler who abandoned his sacred duty for an indulgent passion? Or was he one of history's most tragic figures, a man so suffocated by the gilded cage of his own divinity that he was willing to sacrifice an empire for a single, authentic human connection? Perhaps the answer lies not in judging the men themselves, but in examining the sheer, unmitigated violence of the system's response, the visceral condemnation, the swiftness of the execution, the meticulous, almost hysterical need to not only kill the favorite, but to desecrate his memory and rewrite his past. Does this speak more to the man's moral failure, or to the deep and unforgiving brittleness of the institution he threatened? The true crime of the male favorite was not greed or ambition, but the crime of being an anomaly. He was a force that the system could not categorize, could not regulate, and could not control. He was the ghost in the machine, a walking testament to the terrifying idea that the emperor was not just a divine functionary, but a man, with a man's unpredictable heart. And in the end, it is these hidden histories, these stories that are officially condemned and pushed into the shadows, that often tell us the most about an empire. For the way a power structure reacts to what it cannot define reveals its deepest and most secret anxieties. The story of the cut sleeve, therefore, is more than just a tragic romance. It is a mirror held up to the face of an empire, reflecting a profound fear of disorder, a terror of the untamed human element, and the chilling knowledge that the entire magnificent edifice of the state could be brought to the brink of ruin by something as simple and as uncontrollable as a touch, a glance, or a sleeping head upon a silken sleeve.